Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. I'm Ann Bennett and we're cooking up history here at the Laurel Historical Society in Maryland. Today we're going to take a look at the first American cookbook, American Cookery by Amelia Simmons, published in 1796. Now, this wasn't the first cookbook that was available in America. There were other reprints of English cookbooks, particularly The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy by Hannah Glass was very popular, published in many different editions. But Amelia Simmons' book was the first one written by an American author for an American audience, and that's the important distinction here. A second edition came out in the same year, just a few months following the initial publication of her book. And we think it was published in Albany, definitely kind of in that New York, New England area. And it included revisions and new recipes that she wanted to include, and especially trying to correct some of the mistakes that had made its way into the first edition of the book, which she was very upset about. So in the second edition, we see things like election cake, kind of signaling the American spirit as a newly emerged nation, and also things that we typically associate now with regional New England cooking, chowder, spelled with a U. As you can see, the book is pretty slim. This is a facsimile copy, so there's not a lot of recipes in it. Most of them are pretty simple fare for just, kind of average American families. But some of them are aspirational, meaning they're kind of showy and use a lot of specialized ingredients like queen's cake or plum cake, which use a lot of spices and sugar and dried fruits and many eggs, like up to a dozen eggs in a recipe. We can tell from her instructions and the way she put the cookbook together that she was a skilled cook. So she had spent some time in service learning how to cook and learning the techniques that she used in her cookbook. And we also see a variety of techniques that are familiar to us today and are kind of surprisingly modern for their time that they were published, including the use of a variety of herbs and cooking and baking with wine, which back then was traditionally a French technique. And a lot of the recipes in the cookbook were actually copied from Susanna Carter's cookbook from 1772. This was common in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries to plagiarize books, whole or entire books. And this is actually what happened to Amelia's book once it was published. A lot of people plagiarized her books. This was very common in this time before copyright laws became a thing. But she did include about 24 recipes that were new and featured ingredients that were indigenous to the Americas. And this includes cranberries, including a cranberry sauce that she recommended be accompanied by roast turkey. So we can already kind of see the beginnings of our traditional American Thanksgiving meal. We also see the inclusion of pumpkin and different types of squash, which are American foods. And we see a pumpkin pudding. So although it's baked in a crust, it's more kind of like what we would associate like a pumpkin custard pie today. We also see a winter squash pudding. We see the inclusion of corn and cornmeal in ingredients and recipes, including Indian pudding, Johnny cake or hoe cake, and Indian slapjack, which might be a variation on a flapjack or a pancake. It was basically like a small little pancake type meal. She also includes a recipe for spruce beer, which was popular at the time, and Ben Franklin is famous for having his own recipe for spruce beer. And you also see ingredients for molasses gingerbread, which was really interesting because it reflects the American preference to use molasses rather than the English version of treacle. And you can also see in a couple ingredients, it's really the first documented type of the use of pearl ash in recipes, which was a precursor to our modern baking soda. So this is really kind of the first suggestion of using a chemical or artificial leavener to add lightness to certain things like cookies or cakes. You still see the traditional reliance on beaten eggs for that leavening, but you also see 2 cookie recipes and 2 gingerbread recipes using this pearl ash, which was a byproduct of the laundering process. It's also the first place that you see the word cookie, C-O-O-K-I-E, or C-O-O-K-Y, which was taken from the Dutch word. And again, being in that New England, New York area, Amelia would have been familiar with the term and the item and the recipes. So we don't see the term biscuit, which is what we typically call our cookies in English tradition. We see the use of the word cookie derived from the Dutch word for the same type of dessert product. We also see the word slaw, S-L-A-W, from the Dutch word for salad, referring to like cold slaw or some type of, kind of chopped mixed vegetable salad. We also see a recipe for cupcake. Now this is interesting because it was listed in a recipe called a light cake to bake in small cups, but it's more like a fruit cake, what we think of a fruit cake today with spices and fruits. And it's not until 1828 when Eliza Leslie publishes her receipts for pastry cakes and sweetmeats that we see a more familiar influence, of a more familiar recipe for what we would consider a cupcake. But we still see the influence of Amelia Simmons on Eliza Leslie's recipe, and we can still kind of see the evolution of what we would call a cupcake today in our modern times. It's a cookbook for the history books. It's a cookbook that belongs on your cooking shelf. Not much is known about Amelia Simmons, but it deserves a place on the kitchen shelf and the library shelf. For a deeper dive into the history of Amelia Simmons and what is known about her life and her very famous first American cookbook, I recommend Pamela Cooley's Searching for Amelia, A Quest for the Author of the First American Cookbook. And so by the time we get into several editions of American Cookery, we eventually start to see that it falls out of favor. So by the 1820s, when Eliza Leslie's cookbook is coming out, and then by the 1840s, by the time this mill workers housing is built here in Laurel, you see volumes like Mary Randolph's cookbook coming more into favor, and then you start to see some of the other works being published in the 1840s, like Sarah Josepha Hale's book as well. So it did last for a long time, several editions through several decades of use here in America before it fell out of favor. But I encourage you to pick up a copy, look at it online, and to see the roots of a lot of our American recipes and ingredients that we know and love here today. I hope you enjoyed this bite into history, and join us next time as we cook up some more history here at the Laurel Historical Society.